Hello everyone and welcome to another awesome game from the Menorca Open Tournament round 5. It is Nihal Sarin versus Vasyl Ivanchuk. Nihal almost 100 rating points higher rated than Vasyl. He's a former 2700 player and obviously very strong opponent. He has the white pieces. Both of them are on 4 out of 4. But Vasyl not only on 4 out of 4, he also finished his last 2 tournaments undefeated, and he's now on a 22 game unbeaten streak. He would very much love it if he could keep it, well, like that, make it a 23 game unbeaten streak. But yeah, let's see what happened. Pretty awesome game. Nihal with white opens with pawn to e4. We have pawn to e6. Vasyl goes for the French defense. d4, we have pawn to d5, knight c3, and knight to f6. And here we have the main line, bishop to g5 in the classical French. We have d captures on e4, knight captures, and bishop to e7, and everything gets traded off on f6. Knight captures, bishop captures, queen captures, and the knight to f3. The so-called burn variation of the classical French. Vasyl castles kingside, and now bishop to d3 is the most standard move that everyone plays here. Also why you rush the knight to f3, so the queen doesn't need to guard the d4 pawn. And well, okay, even if the knight wasn't there, you could play it, because if queen captures, you have this very nasty bishop captures on h7, and then your opponent blunders a queen. But okay, it's still the main line. But here, bishop to d3 was not played. Queen to d3. And this has not been played at the absolute top level. It has been played maybe in 1 or 2 games, but with very little success. For example, Mateusz Bartel played it against Amin Tavatabay in Bundesliga this year. Is the only game I found where white actually won. So it's sort of a new idea. And after Vasyl's bishop to d7, he wants to play bishop to c6 and grab hold of this long diagonal. We have queen to e3, wasting a tempo with the queen because the bishop belongs on d3, and then white will play c3, castles queenside, and so on. So this is what Nihal wants to have. He wants castles on opposite sides of the board, and maybe he can play something like h4, h5, h6, or maybe he pushes the h-pawn, gets the rook to g3 to attack the black king. So that's the idea. And Vasyl plays knight to c6. There also are a couple of positions. For example, Jordan Pamphores had it against Alireza Firuzja. He played rook to d8, but he lost. Alireza played it with black, but Jordan lost this game. So another downfall for the white pieces. But here we have knight to c6, and it is now, as of move 10, that we have a completely new game. So okay, Nihal castles queenside. We now have castles on opposite sides of the board, and that usually means a race. So probably whatever Vasyl plays, g4, h4, you know, pawns will start marching up the board. So Vasyl plays rook 8 to d8, and okay, you could maybe start with h4, but first bishop to c4. We have knight to e7, and now knight to e5. g4 again can be played because the knight sometimes wants to come to f5, but also the knight can come to d5, so you're not really stopping it. So here knight to e5 goes after the bishop, bishop to c6, and Nihal trades it very gladly. Knight captures, we have knight captures, and pawn to c3, strengthening that d4 pawn. We have knight back to e7. Vasyl wants to get the knight to d5 or f5, and now again g4 definitely can be played. Rook h to e1. Nihal chooses to centralize his rooks. Vasyl plays pawn to c6, even though you could go for knight to f5, but then queen e5. Okay, queens maybe get traded off the board, and nothing spectacular. c6 will have to be played at some point if you want to stop that pawn to d5 breakthrough. So after rook h to e1, pawn to c6, we have bishop to d3, and knight to d5 now, attacking the queen, queen g3, and okay, now Vasyl has to decide, does he want this to be a race? Does he want to go for the white king? Or does he play queen f4, checks the king, trades the queens, and goes into the endgame? And Vasyl says, alright, let's go for the endgame. Queen to f4 check, we have queen captures, knight captures, and okay, the bishop and the pawn are attacked, so bishop to f1 must be played, and rook to d7. Now Vasyl prepares to double up on the d file. We have king to c2, rook f to d8, and pawn to a4. We have pawn to a5, pawn to g3. Kicks away the knight. We have knight to d5, rook to e5, a very nice rook lift, putting pressure on that a5 pawn, and king to f8. And you might think, okay, can we play pawn to c4 and win the pawn? Well, not really. If you play knight pawn to c4, then the knight comes to b4, and okay, your king is in check. The king has to move. Then you play b6. nothing to worry about. So after king f8, we have bishop to c4, pawn to g6, and now rook d to e1. We have pawn to h5 and pawn to h4. So is there a breakthrough for either of them in this closed position? Obviously, the knight is a little bit better as it is a closed position, but not by a lot. For the moment, it can't really go anywhere. So king e7, we have king to d3, both players just improving the position of their kings, king to d6, pawn to f3, and now rook to h8. It's very hard to say what the idea behind rook to h8 is. Probably just waiting to see what Nihal will do, or maybe even just making it possible for Nihal to make a mistake. Other idea would be something like rook to c7, so if you know, bishop gets traded for a knight and pawn to c4 is played, you already have a rook on the c file. But it would seem Vasyl has calculated everything, and he's inviting Nihal to go for something. Or Nihal could just wait for it, something like king to d2, or maybe instead of rook h8, you could also play pawn to b6. Definitely an option. But here we have bishop captures on d5, c captures, and c4. Nihal goes to open up the position. D captures, we have king captures, and now rook to c7. With check, we have king to d3 and pawn to b6. Sorry about that. So pawn to b6 and rook to b5. Okay, putting pressure on that b6 pawn. We have rook to c6 and rook to e4, with ideas of maybe going after that f7 pawn. But Vasyl just goes rook to b8. We have rook back to e1, king to e7, and now pawn to g4. H captures, we have f captures, and now, well, you could create a passed pawn right away. First rook to d8 was played, and now you could create a passed pawn right away, but first rook to e4, getting another defender here. King to f6, we have rook to f4 check, king to g7, and now pawn to h5. A very tricky move to play is actually pawn to g5, where you limit that black king's mobility and also make this f7 pawn a backwards pawn, and then somehow try to get this rook behind to go after it. One of the options. But here pawn to h5 by Nihal, and now rook c to d6, doubling up on the d file to put pressure on the d4 pawn. We have king to e3, and now rook 8 to d7, adding a defender to that 7th rank. We have h captures on g6, king captures, and now rook to g5, saying that, okay, rook to f6 might be an idea, and maybe I try to, you know, get the king up the board, but still, it's going to be very hard with this pawn on d4. At some point, Nihal should really look for ways to advance the pawn to d5, maybe somehow. So here, king to g7, not allowing rook f6 to come with check, rook to h4, and now rook to c7, and look at the situation on the clocks. Which of course you guys don't see, as I didn't have them in the previous video. Just give me a few seconds. I was pretty sure we had the clock times in the previous video. Probably not, as it wasn't relevant. There we go. So Nihal, having only 36 seconds on the clock, spends 35, and he makes his next move with 1 second, but he makes a blunder. He plays rook to h2. The only way to play this is to play pawn to d5, and then after whatever captures, doesn't really matter. You could capture here, and then after pawn captures, don't go king d4 right away, because rook c4 check will pick up the rook on h4, but you can move the king to d3, or you can play even rook h6, go after the b pawn, and then either king d3 or d4, depending on what Vasyl plays. So that was the way to do it. But Nihal played rook to h2, and now Vasyl is completely winning, or maybe, you know, maybe a super engine would maybe find the defense, but you know, that mostly the problem is that Nihal barely made the move. He played with 1 second, he got a 30 seconds increment, and now Vasyl is completely winning, but only if you find the only idea that wins. And as you guys are not just amazing chess players, but also amazing endgame players, I'm sure you guys already see it. So have at it, you know, while I give you a couple of seconds. Yes, there is a double attack here that is possible, and that is rook to c4. The attacking the d4 pawn and the a4 pawn, and it doesn't matter what you play. If you defend the d pawn, then the a4 pawn falls. and if you play rook to d2, which was played in the game, again, defending the d pawn, rook captures on a4. But okay, it's only one pawn. Maybe Nihal can somehow survive this. We have king to e4, rook to a1, we have king to e5, and now rook to c6. Pawn to d5, finally get rid of that weak pawn, but rook to e1 check, king to f4, and rook to d6, not allowing the trade on e6 to happen. Rook to d3 and king to g6. We have rook d to b3, pawn to e5 check. That is the correct way to play it, and only then will you capture on g5. We have king to f3. King to g4 also doesn't help because first rook to e4 check, then rook to f4 check, so you're going to lose that pawn either way. King f3, and now king captures on g5, and now Vasyl is just up 2 pawns, which is of course completely winning. But he still has to win it. They're both below 1 minute on the clock, and they have to play fast. Rook c3, rook to d1, going after the d5 pawn as well. King e4, and now rook to e1 check. We have king to d3, king to f6. We have king to c2, rook to e2 with check, king to d3, and now rook back to e1. We have king to c2 and pawn to e4. Vasyl starts advancing his passed pawn. We have rook to c7, and rook to e3 now, cutting off the white king from going up the board. Pawn to b4, trying to get rid of the queenside pawns as soon as possible, but Vasyl finds pawn to a4, not allowing the trades to happen, and also this rook is now looking a little bit silly. Rook to b7, and now rook to d3. Rook 7 captures on b6, rook captures, we have rook captures, and king to e5. As the black king is in check, we have rook to a6 going after the a4 pawn. Now rook captures on d5, and this is key. The king is defending the rook is cutting off the white king from going over the d file, and now the e pawn marches forward. We have rook captures on a4, pawn to f5 even. If you play pawn to e3 right away, you can play it, but after pawn to b5, it can be a little bit tricky, because if you capture, then you allow the white king to d3, so you have to calculate a lot. It's still winning, but there's no reason to do it. Pawn to f5, rook to a8, now b5 is pointless, so rook to a8. We have pawn to e3, king to c3, and king to f4, hiding behind the f pawn. Also one of the reasons why f5 is such a nice move. King to c4 and rook to e5. And here Nihal played king to d4, and he was in this position on move 71 that he resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here, because e2, e1, queen, so of course white will have to give up a rook for the pawn. But even if you stop the pawn right away with rook to e1, for example e2, rook to e1, it doesn't matter. King e3, and now you just push the pawn. You're nowhere fast enough to advance the pawn. Now you have to give up the rook, captures, and after b6, okay, it doesn't matter. You're just going to put the rook behind the pawn, and while the white king can protect it, you're going to capture the pawn, give up the rook, and then the df pawn will win the game. So yeah, another brilliant win for Vasyl Ivanchuk. He played this, a very solid line of the French, traded queens, went into an endgame, and outplayed his young adversary in this, most impressive endgame. So there you have it. 23 games undefeated over the course of 3 tournaments. 56-year-old Vasyl Ivanchuk playing. His rating performance is 3,230, which is absolutely incredible. He's crushing it. He's currently on 5 out of 5 this tournament. I don't know if you guys are interested. These are his opponents for over the course of the last 23 games that he is undefeated. He gained some 32 rating points. He regained his rightful spot in the world top 100 chess players, currently number 94, even though we all know he's, at least top 10, top 5 on a good day. But, you also have to play well in every game, not just, be brilliant in some games. But yeah, it seems like he had a good night's sleep, or, whatever he does, because I don't know when he sleeps. He plays a different tournament on a different continent every week. I don't think there's a more active chess player alive, and it's not like, okay, his rating is not high enough to be invited to super tournaments. He's currently 2604, but yeah, he just plays open tournaments and crushes everyone. He just amazing player, and very much looking forward to what he does today in round 6. Unfortunately, I don't know who he's playing against, as chess.com website broke down, or at least the site for the Menorca tournament is down, so I cannot check. And on Leeches, it still says that they haven't been paired, so we'll see. I will keep you guys informed if Chucky does well, and even if he doesn't, if it's an interesting game, I will definitely show it. So that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Big Chucky, dominating chess, as he, has been doing for the last 40 years, let's say. I would like to thank Mohammed Babar Khalil, the Animated Chemist, Crash BPS1, Magician Chess, and Sandal No Last for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing to check up on your wonderful suggestions, and of course on the games of good old Chucky. Thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.